There are deaths that come and go, forgotten by time, swallowed by history. And then there are those that linger, deaths so unnatural, so horrifying, that they do not simply end a life, but etch themselves into eternity. These are not mere tragedies. These are judgments. The Bible holds within its pages stories of terror that go far beyond flesh and blood. Some men were torn apart by unseen forces. Others were swallowed by the earth itself. Some met their fate in a moment of blinding agony, while others were claimed by something darker, something waiting in the silence. These are the deaths that do not simply happen. They are delivered. They do not end with a final breath. They begin when the soul is claimed. Prepare yourself, for these are not just stories. These are warnings. The Rotting King. The feast was magnificent. Roasted lamb, honeyed figs, spiced wine. The air in the great hall was thick with indulgence. Music filled the space, strings plucked with precision, flutes weaving a melody that wrapped around the laughter of nobles. At the head of the table sat King Herod Agrippa I. His robes shimmered like liquid silver, a woven masterpiece that caught the torchlight and sent it glimmering across his broad shoulders. A crown of gold rested upon his head, set with blood-red rubies that gleamed like living embers. His people adored him. His enemies feared him. He had crushed those who dared to oppose his reign, and the people had rewarded his cruelty with worship. A god, they whispered, a ruler touched by divinity. Herod did not correct them. He did not deny them. And that was his mistake. The moment the words left their lips, something shifted in the air. A chill crept through the room, a ghostly draft slithering through the grandeur of the feast. The torches flickered, their flames dancing like they, too, had heard something unseen. Herod lifted his goblet, heavy with jewels, filled to the brim with wine dark as night. But as he brought it to his lips, his fingers trembled. The golden cup clinked against his teeth. A single drop of wine spilled onto his robe, staining the silver fabric with crimson. His heart stuttered. His vision swam. A whisper, faint, just behind him. Not a voice, not in words, but a sound, like rustling, like something writhing in the shadows. He blinked. The room had not changed. His guests still laughed. The music still played. But beneath it, a sensation had taken root in his gut. A twisting, gnawing discomfort. The first pain struck like a blade. A sharp, searing agony tore through his stomach. He gasped, his hand pressing against his abdomen, the heat of pain blooming like fire beneath his skin. Then, movement. Inside him. Something inside him. His breath hitched. The laughter around him became distant, muffled, drowned beneath the sound of his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. The pain worsened, coiling through his gut, his chest, his throat. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. His goblet fell from his grasp, the wine spilling like blood across the marble floor. The pain twisted. Something was burrowing, crawling. Herod staggered, his vision swimming in a haze of agony. His hands trembled as he gripped his stomach, fingers clawing at the silk of his robe. His breath came in ragged gasps. Then the first rupture. A wet, sickening tear. Flesh splitting. A gasp of horror swept through the room as the courtiers nearest to him recoiled, their faces draining of color. A stench filled the air, thick and putrid, worse than rot, worse than death. Herod looked down. His stomach bulged, the skin stretching, warping. Beneath it, movement. A writhing, unnatural motion, as though something inside him was alive. Then the skin broke. A flood of white, glistening, moving things poured from the wound. Maggots, hundreds, thousands. They spilled from his abdomen, wriggling between his fingers, slithering down his robes, crawling over his trembling hands. A scream. Not from Herod, from his guests. The great hall erupted into chaos. nobles stumbling back, chairs crashing to the floor, goblets shattering as people fled. But Herod did not move. He could not move. His knees buckled, his body convulsing. The pain was unbearable now, waves of agony tearing through his insides as more and more of the wriggling blind creatures forced their way out. His breath hitched, his lungs burned. Something moved in his throat. He gagged, choked. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and the maggots spilled forth. His tongue was crawling, his gums, his throat. They poured from his lips, a living, writhing stream of pale, sightless things. His body jerked, a final convulsive twitch, and then stillness. His eyes remained open, lifeless, as the creatures feasted. His once regal body, now a hollow, decaying husk, slumped forward onto the grand table, crushing the golden plates, staining the white cloth with rot. The screams of his courtiers still echoed through the halls. The king who thought himself a god had been eaten alive from within, and the heavens did not weep. The cursed betrayer. The night was thick with shadows. The moon hung low, casting pale light upon the twisted branches of olive trees that swayed in the windless dark. A figure moved through the Garden of Gethsemane, his breath shallow, his steps hurried. Judas Iscariot. His hands trembled, slick with sweat, though the night was cool. Silver jingled in the pouch at his side, 30 pieces, cold and heavy, like stones pressing against his ribs. Payment for a kiss, payment for betrayal. His mind raced, fragments of whispered words and piercing gazes flashing behind his eyes. The look in the teacher's eyes when the guards took him away. Not anger, not fear, just knowing. Judas swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. He had done what he had thought was right. He had played his role. But now the weight of it pressed upon his chest like an unseen hand, squeezing, suffocating. He could not breathe. The wind stirred the trees, or perhaps it was something else, something unseen, something waiting. He stumbled forward, deeper into the garden's gloom. The path beneath his feet seemed to shift, twisting like a serpent, leading him somewhere. He did not know where. He only knew he had to keep moving, had to escape. But from what? The silence pressed against his ears. A silence so deep, so unnatural, that it rang louder than any sound. Then, laughter. Faint. Just at the edges of hearing. Not human. Judas spun around, his pulse hammering. The garden was empty. Just the whispering trees, the cold silver, the weight in his chest. The wind picked up, leaves rustled, the branches above creaked, the shadows shifted. The laughter came again. Closer. Judas turned and ran. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his hands clutching at his robe as his feet pounded against the earth. The silver coins bounced against his side, heavier now, their weight pulling him down. He could feel them pressing into his flesh. He could feel something else pressing down on him. The path twisted. The trees seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching, clawing. Then he saw it. A tree. Not like the others. Its bark was blackened, its limbs skeletal, stretching skyward like dead hands reaching for mercy. The wind did not touch it. It stood still in the night, waiting. His chest heaved. He knew why he had come here. The laughter was gone now. The silence returned, thick, suffocating. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the rope at his waist. He did not remember bringing it. But it was there, waiting. Judas stepped forward. The silver pressed harder against his ribs, burning, searing into his flesh. He clutched at his side, gasping, and when he pulled his hand away, blood. Dark, oozing, trickling from where the coins had embedded themselves in his skin. They were inside him now. His breath came in short, ragged sobs as he fumbled with the rope. His hands moved on their own, looping, twisting, tying. The knot was tight. He did not remember climbing the tree, but he was there now, the rough bark biting into his skin as he secured the noose. The branch above him groaned beneath his weight, the only sound in the crushing silence. His pulse pounded in his ears. The rope was coarse against his throat. Then he let go. For a moment, there was only falling. Then, pain. A snap. A sickening, tearing crack as the rope bit deep, flesh splitting, bone grinding. And then, something worse. The weight of the silver did not disappear. It pulled. His body jerked violently, the coins ripping through his flesh, burrowing deeper, pressing outward. His mouth opened in a silent scream as his stomach bulged, then split. The first coin tumbled free, slick with blood. Then another. Then, all of them. A cascade of silver poured from his belly, tearing him apart from the inside, spilling to the ground like an offering to the darkness. His body convulsed, hanging, empty, a sack of flesh and shattered bone. The laughter returned, not distant this time, close, all around him. Judas swayed, lifeless, his hollowed-out form twisting in the wind. The silver lay beneath him, stained red, gleaming beneath the moon's pale light. A final whispered voice slithered through the trees. The price was paid, and the night swallowed him whole. The death of the godless king. The banquet hall was alive with drunken laughter, golden goblets sloshed with wine, voices roared in delight, and the scent of roasted meats hung thick in the air. Servants scurried between lavishly dressed nobles, their hands shaking as they refilled cups, careful not to meet the gaze of the king. Belshazzar, the ruler of Babylon, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, a man who feared nothing, not gods, not men, not the whispers of coming doom. Tonight was a night of revelry, of power, of excess, of blasphemy. Belshazzar smirked as he lifted his goblet, a stolen relic looted from the temple of the Israelites. It was not enough to defeat his enemies. He had to humiliate their God as well. He drank deep, letting the sacred cup, meant for holy offerings, spill its defilement down his chin. Around him, nobles cheered. Musicians played louder. The air vibrated with indulgence. But then, silence. It did not creep in. It did not build. It fell, heavy and sudden, suffocating the room like an unseen hand had seized the throats of every guest. The torches flickered. The air shifted, colder now, thick with something unseen but present. Then, the hand appeared. A disembodied hand, pale and lifeless, its fingers moving with eerie precision as it etched something into the stone wall. 4 words. Many, many, tekel, uparsin. A whisper moved through the hall, a trembling gasp. Belshazzar's goblet fell from his hand, the wine pooling like blood across the marble. His breath came short. His knees buckled. He stared at the words, but their meaning twisted in his mind like a snake coiling around his thoughts. He tried to rise, to command, to speak, but his tongue felt thick, heavy, useless. The whispering grew. It slithered through the room, a voice without a source, a presence without a body. The words written on the wall burned into his mind, weighed, measured, found wanting. He gasped. The room tilted, the walls seemed to breathe, the shadows crawling. The whispers became laughter, low, taunting, coming from nowhere. Something was here, and it was watching. His stomach twisted. A pain, sharp and sudden, coiled inside him. His fingers clutched at his abdomen, but beneath his trembling hands, his flesh moved. Something inside, something writhing. He lurched forward, his body convulsing. The nobles stepped back, their eyes wide with horror. His skin bulged, pulsing, splitting. A wet, tearing sound. Then, darkness poured out. Not blood. Something black, thick, moving. It crawled from his mouth, from his eyes, from the ripped seams of his body. The laughter grew louder. His own voice joined it, a scream but not his own. It clawed from his throat, a sound too deep, too ancient, too wrong to be human. His vision dimmed. His body shuddered. He hit the floor. He felt himself being pulled away, not just his body, but something deeper. The weight of his soul dragged downward, swallowed by the darkness that slithered from within him. The last thing he saw before the void claimed him was the writing on the wall. Glowing. Burning. And then, nothing. By morning, the Persians stormed Babylon. The gates had been opened from within. The city fell. And Belshazzar, the king who mocked God, was no more. The devoured prophet. The road stretched endlessly before him, dust rising in lazy swirls beneath the heat of the sun. The man walked with hurried steps, his robe flapping against his legs, his breath shallow with exhaustion. He was a prophet, a man who once spoke for God. But now, he was just a man running from a command he had broken. His name had been lost to time, but his story remained. He had been chosen, sent to a distant kingdom to deliver a message of doom. He had been warned, do not eat, do not drink, do not return the same way you came. A simple command, a sacred instruction. But he had failed. A stranger had come to him, an old man who had spoken soft words and told of a new vision from the Lord. Come, eat with me, the man had urged. Come, take food and drink. The prophet had hesitated. He had felt the weight of the warning, but hunger clawed at his insides. His throat burned with thirst, and the old man had seemed wise. So he had eaten. He had betrayed the command, and now, as he walked down the empty road, his heart pounded, not from hunger, not from thirst, but from the feeling that he was being watched. The air shifted. The wind stilled. A presence, unseen, unheard, but there. His pace quickened. The road stretched onward, but the shadows between the trees felt closer. A sound. Soft at first. A low growl, deep, reverberating in the dust beneath his feet. Then, a roar. The lion came from nowhere. A blur of golden fur, of muscle and teeth moving with terrifying speed. Before the prophet could scream, the beast was upon him, jaws locked around his shoulder. Teeth sank deep. Flesh tore. The pain was immediate, a blinding, white-hot agony that shattered his mind. His body was dragged, torn, shaken. But he was not killed, not immediately. The lion did not feast. It did not devour. It simply held him, jaws tight, pinning him to the earth. Blood seeped into the dust. His breaths came in ragged gasps. The world tilted. His vision blurred. He could hear the beast's slow breathing, feel the warmth of its exhale against his cheek. A pause, a moment of stillness. Then, darkness. When the people found him, the sight was unnatural. His body lay limp, torn, but untouched beyond the wound. The lion sat beside him, unmoving, watching, waiting. And next to them, his donkey, standing calmly, unafraid. The beast had killed him, but it had not eaten, because the lion was not hungry. It had only come to deliver judgment. The consumed earth. The ground trembled beneath them, a distant, unsettling vibration that crept through the soles of their feet. Korah stood tall, his arms crossed, his voice sharp with defiance. Before him, Moses stared with unwavering eyes. The prophet had spoken, had warned, had pleaded, but Korah and his followers had mocked him. "We are holy, just as you are holy," Korah had spat. "Who are you to rule over us?" Moses had said nothing. He had only stepped aside, and now the earth shook. A low groan, deep, ancient, as if the ground itself had awakened. The people murmured. They stepped back. Some clutched at their robes, their faces twisted in unease. Then, the first crack. The ground split. A jagged, gaping wound ripped through the dirt, the fissure spreading with terrifying speed. Dust erupted, pebbles danced. Korah took a step back, his confidence wavering, his lips parting as if to speak. But there was no time. The earth opened beneath him. A scream tore from his throat as he fell, not into darkness, not into a pit, but into something alive. The ground did not simply break, it swallowed. His body jerked as an unseen force pulled him down, his hands clawing at nothing. Around him, his followers screamed as their feet slipped, as their bodies were dragged into the widening maw of the abyss. It was not an ordinary pit. It was not natural. It was hungry. The air filled with the deafening sound of tearing earth, of screams that faded too quickly, as if those who fell were being pulled into a place where sound could not escape. The dirt collapsed over them. Silence returned. The ground, now still, bore no sign of what had happened. No bodies, no graves, just emptiness. The people stared, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. Korah was gone. Not dead. Gone. Not to be buried. Not to be mourned. Only remembered as the man who defied God and was swallowed by the earth itself. The death of Herod, the rotting king. The palace was alive with the sound of celebration. A great crowd had gathered, their voices rising in anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of incense, wine, and perfumes meant to disguise the stench of something unseen, something waiting. King Herod Agrippa stood on the balcony, his robes shimmering like molten silver in the morning light. The people below gasped in awe. He smiled, basking in their admiration, his chest swelling with the intoxicating power of their praise. They loved him, they worshipped him, and then they called him a god. The voice of a god, and not of a man, they cried. The words slid through the air like venom, wrapping around him, sinking into his mind, into his very being. He did not deny it. He let the praise settle upon his shoulders like a divine mantle. And in that moment, something changed. The sun, warm and golden just seconds before, grew cold. The light dimmed, not as if covered by a cloud, but as if something vast and hungry had passed over it. Herod felt it before he saw it. A sharp pain coiled inside him, deep in his gut, twisting like writhing fingers beneath his skin. He staggered, gripping the balcony rail. His vision blurred, the faces below stretching into grotesque shapes, grinning, laughing, waiting. Then he felt them move. Inside him, something was crawling beneath his flesh. His breath hitched, his fingers clawed at his stomach, pressing, pushing, but the things inside only burrowed deeper. His veins bulged, his skin turned clammy, his silver robes suddenly too heavy, too suffocating. The pain exploded. Herod screamed, falling to his knees, his hands clutching at his stomach as it convulsed, as the unseen horrors beneath his skin gnawed, chewed, multiplied. Then, the first one broke through. A slick, wriggling thing pushing through the soft flesh of his side. Then another, and another. Worms. Boiling up from within him, from his own flesh, from the seat of his power. They did not feast on his body. They came from it, a punishment, a sentence, a horror birthed from within. His mouth opened in a silent scream as more of them spilled forth, his insides turning to rot before the eyes of his people. The same people who had called him a god now stepped back, their faces twisting in horror and fear. No one touched him. No one helped. The palace, once filled with joyous celebration, now reeked of decay. The king did not die quickly. He writhed, his body betraying him, eaten away from the inside, every breath a new agony. His final moments were not spent in power nor in praise. They were spent in unrelenting horror, as he realized that hell was not waiting for him. It was already inside him.